Whenever we tell a story, there are 4 ways of revealing character in that story. So this video is going to run through those 4 ways in a little detail and end with a homework activity for you to complete. So the 4 ways of revealing a character in a story are through what the character does, what the character says or thinks, what others say or think about the character, and what the narrator tells us about the character. So we'll look at each of those in order. The first of these then, what the character does. This is the most objective information we have about a character because it's factual and it can be observed. So objective means that we can't argue with it, it's a fact, it's just something that you can see and that's what they've done, and you can infer from that what you want. You can read between the lines, you can work out what that tells you about a character just based on what they do. For using this way of revealing character, you're going to need to use show don't tell, which we'll cover in a upcoming lesson. But essentially with show don't tell, it's what it suggests. You're showing what they do, you're not just telling what they do. So you could tell us a character's angry, but you could argue about are they really angry, or you could show the character stomping around, slamming doors and shouting at the top of their voice, and then we can see they're angry. So that's the difference between showing and telling. If you're showing them slamming about, making noises. If you're telling, you're just saying they're angry. Let's look at an example from everyone's favourite story of Mice and Men. Early on we have Lenny being introduced, and here's one thing which Lenny does. The story tells us that Lenny dabbled his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. So we have Lenny splashing in this water, watching the ripples that he makes. That's what he did. We can't argue that that's what he did because that's just a fact. That's an action he's done. What it suggests to us about the character is that he has a sort of childlike fascination with splashing and making ripples in water. So we get an information here which isn't directly stated, but we can get an idea of what sort of character he is. Okay, the second way of revealing character is through what the character says or thinks. This can tell us a lot about a character, but cannot necessarily be trusted, so we have to read between the lines to work out what we're being told. So we get a sense of who people are from what they say, but particularly if someone's talking about themselves, we don't necessarily trust their opinion because they might have certain reasons for presenting themselves in a particularly good way or a particularly bad way. So it gives us a sense of who they are, but you always have to think, can I really trust what they're saying? And again, read between the lines. So here's another example. At one point in Of Mice and Men, Lenny asks, I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? So George has told this lie about Lenny being kicked in the head by a horse as a way to suggest why he has difficulty with certain things, and clearly that's bothered Lenny because he's remembered that. He comes back to it, so he's asking, I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I? Why is he asking this then? We might feel that it's because he's worried about the way he is. Maybe he has a sort of slight awareness that he's not quite like other people and he just wants a bit of reassurance there. Or perhaps he's worried that he's misremembering something, like this is something that's maybe happened to him, but he doesn't remember being kicked in the head, so he wants a bit of confirmation there. But certainly we get a sense that he has a slight worry about his own perhaps ability or intelligence, and he just wants some reassurance about that. Here's another example where we learn about a character through what they say, even without being told something explicitly. So this is a conversation Lenny has with Crux, who is the black man on the ranch who is sort of segregated from the others, and Crux is angrily saying, you go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room. Why ain't you wanted? Lenny asked. 'Cause I'm black. So Crux has to spell it out for him. Now just through this question, we again get the information about Lenny, but he doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't really understand racism. He's too sort of naive for that. He has no idea why Crux isn't wanted with the rest of them. So again, it's just reinforcing this idea that Lenny isn't quite the brightest button in the box. Okay, on to the third way of revealing character, what others say or think about the character. This is a really interesting way of putting across character, because you're actually putting across two characters at the same time. So this one is highly subjective. So if objective means it's factual information we can't argue with, subjective means it's more like an opinion. It can be argued with, it can be taken in different ways. So this way of revealing characters is highly subjective, can be taken lots of different ways, because it's based on a limited point of view of another character, and they might have their own agenda or reason for saying something. So they might criticise another character, say that they're really bad or ugly or rubbish or something, perhaps because they're jealous of that character or they just dislike that character for some reason. And then we're learning that the character criticising is perhaps jealous or dislikes them for some reason. So the information might not be entirely reliable, but it does tell us something about the other character who's saying it as well. Let's look at another example from Mice and Men. This is the part where George is telling Slim about why him and Lenny got kicked out of the ranch in Weed. Of course he ain't mean, George says about Lenny, but he gets in trouble all the time because he's so goddamn dumb. Like what happened in Weed. He's seen this girl in a red dress. Dumb bastard like he is, he wants to touch everything he likes. Just wants to feel it. So he reaches out to feel this red dress, and the girl lets out a squawk, and that gets Lenny all mixed up, and he holds on because that's the only thing he can think to do. So everyone else in Weed, including this girl whose dress Lenny has grabbed, thinks that Lenny's trying to rape her or otherwise attack her. But obviously George knows differently. George knows the other side of the story, that Lenny just likes to touch anything that's sort of soft. So we get a few opinions from George here. George says he ain't mean. So we know that George thinks Lenny is kind. That might be supported through other things we've seen in the story. It might not, but we know that at least George thinks that he's kind, he's not mean, he wouldn't hurt anyone deliberately. We also know that George thinks he is goddamn dumb. So we know that George thinks he's not very intelligent. He uses the word dumb twice, and that is backed up by various things we see throughout the story, including what we've already covered about Lenny being naive and not understanding racism and having a sort of childlike fascination with the pond. So we're getting information about Lenny here, that he's dumb and he's not mean, he's quite nice. And we're also getting information about how George feels about Lenny, because George is defending Lenny here. Okay, on to the final of the four ways of revealing character. So this is what the narrator tells us about the character. This is the quickest way to sum up a character, and is generally reliable, assuming the narrator is reliable. So I ask the question, what's the difference between a reliable and an unreliable narrator? Well, a reliable narrator, we can trust what they say, we believe them. An unreliable narrator, we don't trust them, we don't believe them. Often, if you're telling in the third person, we can generally trust the narrator because it's its voice outside of the story. Why would they lie to us? If it's a first-person narrator, perhaps telling their own story, they might make things seem better or worse than they are for their own reasons, so then they become unreliable. So think about whether you can trust the narrator or not. Assuming you can trust the narrator, then this is a very quick way to sum up a character. Now it's really good for quickly establishing fact, but it's not very interesting. It's telling rather than showing. So it's telling that someone is angry rather than showing them stomping about, slamming doors. You should only use this way of revealing character very occasionally, so you can move on to more interesting details. It's just a kind of quick and dirty way to cover facts about a character. Let's look at some examples. Again, talking about Lenny, behind him, so behind George, walked a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. So we just get a quick physical description of Lenny. We know immediately what he looks like. We don't need to go into loads of detail with this, it just gives an idea of what he looks like, and we might start judging from that. He's got a sort of shapeless, almost doughy face, so perhaps that begins to suggest something about his personality. He's got large pale eyes, his shoulders slope downwards, which suggests maybe he's not very confident. So they're just quick facts which we can immediately picture Lenny with. What the narrator can tell us also depends on the type of narrator you have. So as well as narrators, some being reliable but we can trust, some being unreliable but we can't trust, we also have two other types of narrators, which are omniscient and limited. Omniscient means all-knowing. Omni means all, scient means like knowledge or knowing. So this narrator knows everything, including what every character is thinking. When you're writing your story, you might have a limited narrator who only knows the thoughts of one character. So this narrator can only go into one character's head rather than all the characters. Either would be fine for a short story. So to recap, 4 ways of revealing character. You can reveal character through what the character does, through what the character says or thinks, what others say or think about the character, what the narrator tells us about the character. What I would like you to do for next week, so this is your homework, is to pick a character that you already know about, perhaps from a film, a game, a book, an anime, a TV series, any form of storytelling, and I would like you to describe one of each of those 4 ways of revealing character that we just covered. So pick your character, I want you to tell me something the character does, something the character says or thinks, something others say or think about the character, and something the narrator tells us about the character. Now for this last one, particularly if you're using a film, game, or anime or TV series, it may not have a narrator to tell us anything about the character. If that's the case, I would like you to pick one of the others and tell me something else for one of the other ones. If it's a book, then you should be able to do that, or if it's a written story, you should be able to do that for one. Okay, so one of each of these 4 for a character of your choice that already exists.